author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
An immovable object and an unstoppable force. What happens when two worlds, in this case the legislative and executive, collide? What are the symptoms of Bidenomics, and is political persecution distinctly un-American? All this and more on today's show. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Today we examine the state of the GOP House, the state of the Union, the state of the economy, and political persecution. That's a lot of states. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. With the House of Representatives firmly in the grip of the Republican Party, President Biden has a unique opportunity to demonstrate that long-promised unity he assured America would be the hallmark of his terms in office, or term. But what if it's all just bluster? Well, we're joined by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Tim Donner, to figure out what is the present relationship between the legislative and the executive during the time of Joe Biden. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
So tell me, the GOP, they have a slim majority, but it is still clearly a majority. Are we going to see Joe Biden working hand in hand with the lower chamber, or was this all just sweet whispered words of a pillow talk inauguration for an expectant public?
Joe Biden will promote unity to the extent that it benefits his efforts at re-election. I think that's the answer, because it didn't serve his purposes to be bipartisan the last 2 years, where he had the trifecta, control of the House and Senate as well as the White House. Didn't serve his purposes then. It will serve his purposes now. I suspect, particularly on this the debt limit issue, that he's going to attempt to demagogue the issue as saying that Republicans want onerous spending cuts that will destroy people's lives. And the Republicans will counter by saying that, we're on the edge of fiscal doom, shall we say, with a $32 trillion debt limit that goes up by hundreds of millions of dollars every single week, unabated. So, this is a dance that we've seen in Washington before, where the establishment understandably says we have to pay our bills. We cannot be, we can't default because it will ruin our credit standing and all the cascading consequences from that. So we have to pay our bills at any cost, which then thwarts the idea that you can put any kind of limits on spending. And I'm talking about for both parties. But in terms of overall bipartisanship, I think there are some areas where there could actually be some agreement on some things, probably international issues more than anything else. But again, everything needs to be looked at through the lens of, does it benefit Joe Biden's reelection campaign?
So does that mean that the Republicans are not going to get anything, in your opinion, domestically for their base, or what they perceive that their base wants?
Virtually nothing. What they've gotten is an open amendment process demanded by the most conservative of Republicans as a pretext for their vote for Kevin McCarthy, famously for Speaker of the House. But it's benefiting a lot of left-wing Democrats too. Even Ilhan Omar saying that she's excited at the amendment process, particularly in one bill where there were like over 50 amendments offered because of the open process. So McCarthy has sort of unwittingly benefited the Democrats by doing that. But the other side of Biden, the advantage that he has that he didn't have the last 2 years, is that he can blame the Republican House for everything, because he's not going to blame his own party over the last 2 years, but now that Republicans have the House, he's going to blame them for stonewalling. He's going to blame them for shutting down, terrific progressive ideas that would otherwise pass, this sort of thing. So it'll be a Mexican standoff, if you're allowed to say that anymore, between the president and McCarthy. And I think these talks about the debt limit are nothing more than a stare down and a game of chicken to see, who relinquishes their control first.
It's interesting that you use the term the Mexican standoff there, which I do believe is still acceptable in most circles, because I kind of envisioned the situation with Kevin McCarthy. I don't know if you've seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, written by the great author and screenwriter William Goldman, starring Robert Redford and Paul Newman, in the very last scene where the Bolivian army is surrounding them, and they have this unique positivity of, what about Australia? And then they come out guns blazing, and obviously we know what happens to them. And it seems to me that Kevin McCarthy and his merry band of Republicans are pretty much in that situation, because all they've really got going forward into November 2024, it's to create a kind of a GOP persona that his party can present to the public. And that persona can either be the happy obstructionist persona, or principled but doomed. I'm not sure. What do you make of that idea?
Well, I think because of the fact that you've got different parties controlling the House and Senate, we can stipulate that virtually nothing's going to get done legislatively, which means the focus is going to be pretty much on the presidential race, whether Biden's going to run again. Apparently, Nikki Haley is now ready to announce her candidacy for the Republican nomination. Ron DeSantis seems sure to follow, probably Mike Pompeo, probably Mike Pence, and some others. And I think that persona that you're talking about is going to largely be established by who ends up on the top of the ticket in 2024, but the presidential candidate. But I think that whether it's DeSantis or Trump, we're still talking about a MAGA-dominated Republican Party, and the MAGA portion of the Republican caucus certainly flexed their muscles during the speakership election process. So that's going to largely define the party, I think, and the contrast will be as clear in 24 as it was in 20.
Okay, I think part of this fact that, as we both agree, that the Republicans really aren't going to be able to get very much done during this period. It's obstructionism or nothing. And this really does, I think, show how divided the nation is with its two parties. And when the founders set this whole thing up, did they anticipate such battles between the branches or between members within Congress?
I think they did. I think they definitely did. And they saw it as a feature, not a bug, because what they envisioned was a long, deliberative process for any kind of major legislative change or any change to the law. Anything that was a significant public policy change or introduction of a new public policy would necessarily need to have very broad consensus in the House, the Senate, and among the states, so that, unlike what the progressives think, where they want to just rush through anything that's sort of the new issue of the day, the point of the constitutional structure is to make major change very deliberative and reliant on very broad consensus.
So some would say in a conservative manner, Tim.
Well, for example, the Supreme Court, the so-called conservative justices are actually constitutionalists, as opposed to progressives who want to read things into the Constitution rather than read what the Constitution actually says.
Okay, we're talking with Tim Donner on the House GOP. After this short break, we'll be right back with Tim asking if America is on the wrong track. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Now, earlier in the show, we discussed how the House is faring under its new leadership. But next up, I want to dig into the current state of play for America, especially with the President's State of the Union address coming up this week. Now, Tim, first of all, how are you doing? And perhaps slightly more importantly, how is America doing?
Well, I don't think almost any objective, and it's harder to find objective analysts these days than ever before. I don't think anybody can say that life is better now than it was in 2019, which was the last time we had normalcy in the before days, pre-pandemic. So comparing then to now, I mean, we had a roaring economy. Jobs were plentiful, more than could be filled, which is true now, but for different reasons. And there was a sense of dynamism in the economy during the Trump era. You don't have that now. And people feel it. They feel inflation, even though it's fallen a bit. They see the price of eggs, for example, and that is probably emblematic of these low right direction, wrong direction numbers. The overwhelming majority of it's over 70% now believe we're on the wrong track. At the same time, Mark, I have to say, I don't remember the last time a majority of Americans said we were on the right track. I really don't. I mean, I think it might have been during the Reagan era. But since then, the country's always been on the wrong track, according to a majority of Americans. It's only a matter of whether it's 30% or 40% think we're on the right track as opposed to the wrong track, it seems.
Yeah, it's down to 28% now, which I believe it flirted around the 29, 30, 31 for a few months, but we're back to where we were in November now. And it seems this obviously includes a whole lot of Democrats, but another interesting poll I came across was a Gallup survey on the most important issues facing Americans. And this is always one of my favorite polls of the year. Coming in number one with a bullet was poor leadership, usurping last year's top issues of inflation and the economy. Now, could it be that folks now see the economic issues they experience as an extension of the leadership that now they're just recognizing could be responsible for those said issues? Does that make any sense at all?
Well, I think that you can ascribe a number of characteristics to Joe Biden, but leadership would not be one of them. And I think most people would agree with that. He came to office as a placeholder. He basically said he would be a placeholder to get Trump out and then set the stage for younger Democrats to take hold of the nomination. I think he's rethought that, of course, because once you have the power of the Oval Office, it's very difficult to give it up unless you really want to. Like, for example, Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1968, he'd had it. He was done. There was no way that he could handle being in the Oval Office anymore. Now, there's a lot of people that think that Joe Biden can't handle being in the Oval Office, that he hasn't been able to from the beginning. I mean, there's not a single event, honestly, Mark, that Joe Biden speaks at where he doesn't make some embarrassing gaffe or tell some falsehood that he told before that had already been outed as false, but he tells it anyway. Look, the guy is not seen as a leader. He's seen simply as the guy who was able to take down Trump. And for Democrats, that's a huge feather in his cap. But I think the basically right now, the identity of Joe Biden is different because he's an incumbent, and it may well be someone other than Trump who gets a nomination for the Republicans in 24.
Yeah, I think part of pitching himself for 2024 will take place during his upcoming State of the Union address. I mean, this is a great opportunity because he has had a recent win. He's had the midterms, which weren't anywhere near as bad as just about everybody anticipated. And that, I mean, that's in the win column for him. There's no doubt about it. So I think using that momentum, and let's be fair, bursts of momentum are few and far between for President Joe Biden. I think he's going to use his address to frame himself for 2024 based on the midterms. What do you think is going to go into that?
Well, the 2022 elections were actually more similar to 2020 than people think, because the shadow of Trump was still hanging over the Republican Party, for better or worse. And you had probably at least a dozen congressional candidates who were basically received the nomination exclusively because they were handpicked by Trump, who wound up losing in seats that could have been won. They were part of the formulation of the 20 to 30 seats most people expected the Republicans to pick up. So the question is how Joe Biden can do without the shadow of Trump over him, which may or may not be true in 2024. It's hard to see Trump just going away quietly, even if he doesn't get the nomination. And if he does, Biden will simply make the case, look, I beat him once, I'll beat him again. And then the formula becomes exactly the same for Biden, which is, of course, he's not a leader, but he's a guy, perhaps the guy, who can beat Trump because he's already proven he can.
You know, I rarely disagree with your analysis, Tim, but I am going to on this one occasion.
Please do.
I don't think it was solely Joe Biden being the right man for that particular job. The job obviously being to remove Donald Trump from office. It was a combination of COVID and Joe Biden. And
I agree.
Oh, there we go. We're back on.
No, I agree.
And he doesn't have COVID anymore. Well, he may have COVID. I hope not. But
the trouble is, you cannot freeze March 2020 in time and say that Trump definitely would have won if the pandemic didn't hit. I think a lot of us believe that's true. I believe that's true, that the pandemic basically crushed him. I think the violence across cities across the country also was crippling to him, even though it should have been so detrimental to the left. It was a sense of chaos that was created. So I don't disagree. And I'm not saying that Biden is a better candidate than Trump per se. What I'm saying is, given all the circumstances he was declared the winner of that election, so he can rightly claim to his party and to the anti-Trump forces across the nation that he beat him once. If I were him, that's the subjunctive, I would definitely play that card, because that's the best card he has. He can't do it on his leadership. He can't do it. He could try to do it on his legislative record, but a lot of that stuff is far left and budget busting. So his best argument, seems to me, is that he can do again what he's already done once.
Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The presidency of Joe Biden, and with him elected Democrats across the nation, appear to be enthralled to a progressive new method of spending taxpayer funds. This is Bidenomics. What are the tenets of this ideology, the pitfalls, and are there any advantages from an economic standpoint? Well, we're joined by economist and author Andrew Moran to pass the facts from the spin. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, it seems that inflation is easing somewhat and gas prices are stabilizing, albeit at twice what they were when Biden took office. So stabilizing high, let's say. Isn't this due to Biden's economic policies?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, if you look at if you use gas prices as an example, the White House came out with a fact sheet a few months ago that said that depleting the strategic petroleum reserves by 40% only saved American taxpayers up to 40 cents at the gas pump. So not necessarily. When it comes to inflation, again, not because of Bidenomics. The Inflation Reduction Act only became effective January 1st. A lot of things aren't even going to happen until the IRS, issues its approval. Mostly the inflation coming down is due to a couple of things. The Federal Reserve raising interest rates, that's traveling through the system, and two, killing demand for a lot of goods and services that were, contributing to inflation. So no, overall, you and I discussed this before. I can't really blame Biden for taking credit for inflation coming down. He was primarily blamed for inflation going up, even though it was a multitude of factors like the Federal Reserve and the American Rescue Plan, all those things.
Yeah, you kind of really can't take the credit for bringing inflation down and bringing gas prices down unless you take the blame for pushing them up through your policies in the first place. So can you define Bidenomics for me?
Well, I guess one doctrine, as I recently wrote on Liberty Nation, was reward work, not wealth. I think that's one tenet of Bidenomics. Another one is probably only the government can intervene and save the economy. The government is your master. The government is the best investor in the economy. So perhaps all those tenets can define the Biden economic doctrine.
Well, let's talk about reward work, not wealth. Now, you wrote an article on this for Liberty Nation very recently, and how the Biden administration plans to reward one, but not the other. I'm sure you can guess which one. Now, this strikes me as a troublesome way to look at things. What's your analysis?
Yeah, I've heard this phrase many times over the last couple of years. I don't know why I didn't touch upon it before, but so I recently did. And it's frustrating because they go hand in hand. When you work and you work hard enough and you build your human capital, you develop wealth. But work happens because of wealth. If I'm a wealthy person, I'll invest in a factory. I'll invest in a new company. I'll invest in hiring people. And that, of course, will produce work. This whole idea, I guess it comes from the idea that the government is the true provider of wealth generation. By thinking that you can just dig ditches and that's going to create wealth and that's real work. But it's a Marxian idea, or perhaps even as I said in my article, that it's a Care Bears economics, whereby we're all being celebrated for work, but those evil billionaires are going to be penalized through the tool of the state. But it's nonsense. Billionaires provide the work, and people who work can accumulate wealth. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, it seems that there's a bit of a disconnect between the understanding that what you have is you work, and then through your work you create wealth, and in an ideal world that wealth will then create more wealth for you. That there used to be a saying that I'm sure has not been uttered through anybody's lips for a good 50 years or so, but when you're in your 20s you make your money with your hands. When you're in your 30s, make money with your money.
Yeah, I agree. But what's funny too about this is that what's the one entity that destroys wealth and that actually has proven the last couple of years to destroy work? It's the government. I'm
not sure, but does it live in a particularly large pale house in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
It's true, and the Federal Reserve too. You can say also the Eccles Building is the chief destroyer of wealth through its, through the inflation tax, destroying your purchasing power. And then work has been deterred too, because the last couple of years when President Biden, when he sweetened the unemployment benefits, that deterred a lot of people from going back to work. You still have this labor shortage going on today. So the government has actually penalized both work and wealth. So I find that comical when you start diving deeper into it.
Well, at least they're doing it fairly, right? Penalizing everybody across the board. Now, doesn't this just encourage people not to save, though? And eventually, won't that, and I'm not sure if I'm phrasing this right, but create a society where living paycheck to paycheck becomes the done thing? Now, I know a lot of people do that anyway, but it's not a situation that anybody really wants to be in. But if we're penalizing wealth, isn't that what's going to happen?
Well, look at the data. People are hardly saving as it is now. The last numbers, I think, from the Bureau of Economic Analysis was 2.9%, and that's historically low. That's even lower than it was, freaking 25 years ago. It's mind-numbing to me how little people are saving. But I always think of a great there was I think it's either in the Free to Choose book or in this Free to Choose documentary where Milton Friedman was discussing how you can't really fault people for not saving due to two things. One, inflation. Two, artificially low interest rates. Because if I deposit my $500 or $1,000 into the bank, I get pennies on the dollar. I get a few pennies a month in interest. Why would I want to save that money when I could just go out protect the wealth, the capital I have now. You take advantage of the purchasing power now and just buy stuff. I think that's actually part of the time preference theory. That's
I think what you mean by the time preference theory there, just for our listeners, is that the idea that, for example, with inflation running at say 5%, just for example, if you buy $1,000 worth of goods now rather than saving it and earning, let's say, $1 over the period of a year, you'll actually be saving 4%, because if you buy that same thing next year, it will actually cost more because of the inflationary measure. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
Hey, I have learned something by paying attention to the...
If you buy those Funko Pop dolls, that's an appreciating asset too.
All right, Andrew, there's another topic I want to talk about. It's slightly off Bidenomics, but perhaps it does tie in somewhat. Now, there's a lot of talk about redoing the whole tax system, and there's people talking about the Fair Tax Act, and there's people in Washington talking about getting rid of income tax entirely and then just having a sales tax. Tell me the details.
So the House Republicans recently proposed legislation to get rid of pretty much all federal taxes, gift taxes, income taxes, state taxes, payroll taxes. And in its favor, they want to impose a 23 to 30% national sales tax. Now, on the one hand, I mean, and the Biden administration, Democrats are just, they're focusing mainly on how Republicans want to raise the sales tax and get rid of the income tax.
Sorry to interrupt, Andrew. I have seen that a lot on the social media with notable Democrats, high-ranking Democrats, saying they want to increase they want to put a 30% tax on you without mentioning, and not a single one of them mentions, whilst removing your income tax.
And what's funny too is how they analyze the situation. So they're saying, "Oh, the Republicans, they want to get rid of the income tax and raise impose a national sales tax because they want to help the wealthy." But there's two things about that. If I'm a billionaire, I'm not earning my money through getting a steady paycheck. I'm earning my money through investment and stock and equity and all that stuff. And two, the rich are the ones who would pay more of the national sales tax because they're the ones who are buying the yachts, they want to buy the boat, the expensive mansions, all those things. So that's mind-numbing to me. But at the same time, I'm against a national sales tax because, as Murray Rothbard said, that's a tax on living. If I want to go out and buy a loaf of bread or rent an apartment, whatever the case, I'm taxed for that. So I'm taxed for going in my day-to-day life. But at the same time, I'm clearly in favor of abolishing income tax, abolishing estate taxes, gift taxes, all those things. I mean, though that's a completely beneficial idea. But a sales tax, no.
So Andrew, let's rate Bidenomics here. Does it get an A+, an A-, an F-, a Z?
And pretty much any economic doctrine that depends on government gets an F for me. There's been really anything good coming out of this administration economics wise. So yeah, I have to give it an F. Sorry, President Biden.
That's an F from Andrew Moran, and we're talking with Andrew on the tenets of Bidenomics. Up next after this short break, we're talking liberty with Scott D. Cosenza, and there's no end in sight for the troubles for Christian bakers. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With political persecutions heading through the courts, it seems the legal world is in the grip of contrariness. Now, are there any protections from political persecution in the United States? Well, this is just one of the questions that will hopefully be answered after speaking with our special Talking Liberty segment, legal affairs editor and host of the Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you for having me once again.
So, Scott, let's talk about a certain Mr. Phillips who made headlines a few years ago now for refusing to bake a cake celebrating gay marriage. Now, it seems that even after the resolution of that case, folks want to see him spend the rest of his days in court. What's happening now for Mr. Phillips?
It's a war by the woke against Mr. Phillips. He just wishes to be able to control who he bakes and decorates cakes for, and the woke left, progressive left, will not let him, Mark. The original Masterpiece Cake Shop case, Mark, was ruled on in 2018, but the Supreme Court didn't rule on the question they agreed to take the case to resolve. That question was notably, did Mr. Phillips' free speech rights and his free expression rights under the First Amendment protect his right to decline to bake a cake for a same-sex couple? Instead of ruling on the case, they discovered that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission was so openly hostile to religious expression generally that they needn't reach the ultimate issue. They just said that this commission was so bad for anybody religious, including Mr. Phillips, they were just going to basically grant him relief. The problem is for the rest of Americans and for Mr. Phillips moving forward, that doesn't resolve the core question, which is, can a person refuse this type of service? I see you want to come in there.
I do, yeah. So essentially what happened was the Supreme Court failed to issue what you'd call a bright line ruling.
They didn't issue any ruling on the facts. In other words, to address the matter that they decide which question is to be resolved when they take a case, right? People apply to the Supreme Court. They say, please take my case and resolve X, Y, or Z. The Supreme Court says, okay, we'll take your case, and here's the question we aim to resolve with our taking of the case, and they haven't done it. Then they took this other case, Mark, during the current term. This is the 303 creative case, and this is about whether or not a woman is allowed to advertise her wedding website company and disclose in those advertisements that she doesn't wish to take either trans clients or same-sex couples as clients. But the thing is, when the Supreme Court agreed to take this case, Mark, they left out the free exercise question. So they said, we're going to take the case to decide whether or not this is a violation of your right to free expression, but not whether it is incorporated in the free exercise protections. In other words, the right to worship one's religion as one sees fit.
And of course, because, again, they seem to be ducking the original question for Mr. Phillips, on the very day that the Supreme Court jettisoned his case without an answer, he received a very particular order at his cake shop, didn't he, Scott?
Well, actually, it was the day they agreed to take the case in the first place, Mark. The day they agreed to take the case, not willing to kind of like let the process play out. Autumn Scaradino, I believe her name is a trans lawyer activist who is one of these people who's not going to let Mr. Phillips rest and decorate cakes for whom he wants. A true cry bully, having already won all these legal rights. They want to punish people who it's sort of like a re-education camp sort of situation, right? He's not allowed to think the things that he thinks, which is, again, that he doesn't wish to use his making powers to celebrate unholy, in his mind, events. By the way, this is a guy, Mark, who does not do like Halloween treats at his bakery because of his religious observance. So
now let's be very clear on this, Scott. This was not just a coincidence that Scaravino happened to call that baker. It was purposely designed because Mr. Phillips was going through the Supreme Court trial and they wanted to pile on.
For the first cake, Mark, it was an accident that the two customers became activists. Okay, they actually just wanted a cake. But Scaradino did not just want a cake. They wanted to be refused the production of a cake for the purpose of then using the refusal to punish and go after Mr. Phillips. Now, the Colorado courts have once again ruled against him. I suspect that this is going to go up through the federal courts then and perhaps again to the Supreme Court, because we don't have that ruling that they could have made, and some of us think perhaps should have made in the original Masterpiece Cake Shop ruling.
So would you class this as a lawyer yourself, Scott? Would you class this as a good faith argument designed to test the legality of the First Amendment, or does it seem more not good faith, as in it's a personal piece of bullying? I mean, that's what it seems to me as a non-lawyer. It seems that somebody's using the courts for their own glorification and for the personal punishment of somebody who disagrees with them. And
I think it's hard to be a victim. So the Colorado Civil Rights Commission and Colorado law has established that people are victims if they are attempting to purchase goods or services and can't because of their immutable characteristics, and that's what this is about. But if you don't actually wish to purchase the cake, Mark, if the call that you made to order the cake was designed to have this burlesque play out, like that you really wanted a cake and you didn't want, the best thing that ever happened was this person's cake order was refused. They they didn't want a cake. They wanted the refusal. And so for that reason, it does seem a bit manufactured. Although I hate to give anybody an idea that might be a reason to dismiss the case, because once again, I think that we need a ruling on this issue, whether, it involves, Mark, what constitutes speech and where the line with commerce and religion kind of meet and diverge. So, if it weren't a commercial activity, we probably wouldn't have these questions arise, but it is. But you can think of all sorts of manners where if somebody offers like song composing services for, a YouTube style video, would they do that for somebody who has a message that they, they abhor? There's all kinds of little things that we can invent to think of ways this would actually pop up, and creators want to know.
You see, the way I kind of envision this, and obviously everybody who listens to Talking Liberty knows that I'm not the legal half of this team, Scott. But the way I kind of view this in terms of where do I think it's right, where do I think it's wrong, because we all make these judgments to ourselves, is if somebody asked a black baker to make a cake celebrating their Klan rally, would the Colorado courts have insisted that the baker make the cake?
We actually have a case in the record. I'm going to change the facts just a little bit, Mark, because this is actually part of the record of the Colorado Appeals Court, which is they went around to a couple bakers and asked them to put on anti-homosexual messages from the Bible. I can't remember if it's like Leviticus or Deuteronomy or whatever, but there's some explicitly anti-gay quotes that are available. And they didn't, they did a number of refusals took place where bakers said, I'm not going to, write that on a cake. And then they say, well, why can't we go against those bakers? And the answer is because they said they wouldn't write that on any cake. And if we tease that out for a second, Jack Phillips says, the owner of Masterpiece Cake Shop, that he will bake a cake with a pink inside and blue icing if the celebration or event or occasion is not one that he disagrees with. So if, for instance, there was a person whose two favorite colors were pink and blue, and they just decided they wanted a cake because, that was the only reason, Jack Phillips says he would make that cake. But the idea is that the black baker, for instance, in your hypothetical, would not ever make a cake celebrating a Ku Klux Klan rally. It doesn't matter what the sort of quote unquote like celebration or purpose of it was. They just wouldn't do that thing. So that's how the court has wrestled with that question.
So what we're looking for then, Scott, is a bright line ruling, one way or the other, from the Supreme Court. Do you think they will give it this time?
Absolutely not. They will crush our dreams for this kind of clear rulemaking, Mark, and break our hearts as they have done so many times before.
No clear thinking from the Supreme Court. You heard it first from Scott DeCosenza. Scott, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's episode of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Andrew Moran, and Scott DeCosenza, and of course you, the listeners at home, for tuning in. My parting shot for this week, I'd like to remind you of the words of John Stuart Mill, who said, quote, "The idea that truth always triumphs over persecution is one of those pleasant falsehoods which most experience refutes. History is teeming with instances of truth put down by persecution. If not put down forever, it may be set back for centuries," end quote. Now, just because someone is persecuted, it doesn't mean they'll eventually be righteously vindicated. And that's something we all need to remember. Sometimes justice doesn't prevail. And that might be the story of modern America. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone, hosted by Liberty Nation's
I'm
Lisa
Lisa
K.
K.
Donner,
Donner.
joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors, deconstructing
Postal
leftist
service was
narratives,
shut down.
debating the hot topics, and remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe
You only
space.
did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative Five.